Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant. I'm not sure if it's because I've been binge watching what I think is the best series on TV, AMC's *Halt and Catch Fire*, maybe the best ever. Or maybe I wanted to advance my craft by trying something different, or there's a larger point I subconsciously want to make. Yeah, I'd bet on that one. But somehow, juxtaposing Sony's new a99II with a 1999 iMac makes sense to me. Wait, is it just because they share the number 99? No. It's because they're both brilliant devices, two sides of the same coin, separated by almost 20 years on the one hand, yet each better than the other, depending upon from which angle you view them. And maybe something about how old current camera manufacturing thinking is when it comes to software interfaces, as in circa the 1980s. Because where you might think the Mac is a triumph of ease of use over specs, it was hardly the most powerful machine back in the day, you might equally conclude the a99II is a triumph of specs over ease of use. I'd say, to anthropomorphize a camera, the a99II does not suffer fools gladly. You need to understand what it can do, when it can do it, and how best to harness it. Put differently, just because the a99II can do something doesn't mean it will. In this regard, it's very un-Mac-like, maybe a little bit like a racehorse or a piano. The key becomes you, or in this case, me. But it is fast, almost psychically fast, straight out of the box for stills photography, as this quick trip to a local farmer's market shows. Let's start with the obvious. Beyond my limited abilities generally, or the limits of my knowledge of the a99II specifically. The a99II is a technological tour de force. It sports the industry's best hybrid sensor, the same 42 megapixel Exmor-R found in its cousin the A7R2. It offers a wild autofocus capability called continuous hybrid phase detection, which uses not only sensor AF, but a second completely separate, dedicated AF-only sensor made usable by its semi-transparent mirror. The a99II sports 5-axis in-body image stabilization, burst rates up to 12 frames per second with autofocus, variable frame rates from 1 to 120 frames per second in full HD, S-Log, ISO down to 50, good thing, up to 102,400. The bottom line is the camera is capable of phenomenal imagery across a broad swath of scenarios, far more than I could pull together in the short time I had the gear. Now, add to that the fact that the A-mount offers a more complete set of lenses than any other Sony camera, consisting not only of the obligatory 16-35, 24-70, 70-200, 2.8s, but a pile of primes. 16 2.8 fisheye, 22 2.8, 24 2.0, 35 2.8 macro, 35 1.4, 35 1.8, 50 millimeter 1.4, 85 millimeter 1.4 and 1.8, 100 2.8 macro, 135 1.8, 2.8, a 300 millimeter 2.8, a 500 millimeter f4, and a pile of consumer spec variable aperture zooms. But even more interesting to me is that the A99II seems to be a testbed Sony has been more comfortable experimenting with than its E-mount cameras, at least to this point, and NAB is only weeks away. I mean things like the hybrid autofocus, the joystick on the back, a uniquely articulating rear LCD, and that unique pellicle mirror. Though to be fair, Canon introduced pellicle technology back in 1965 with its Pellix QL. But what's most interesting to me is this. Who's it for? And why? Well, the A99II is clearly an incentive for current A-mount lens owners to stay invested. It's an ergonomic and speed argument for DSLR shooters to make the switch to Sony and mirrorless. On the basis of specs and physical handling, it might even be a path for E-mount shooters looking to move up to dual card slots, dual rotary controls on the right side, and a heft and presence that says, mirrorless is for professionals too. Let's go a little bit deeper. The A99II is a solid chunk of a camera, significantly bigger, heavier, and better fitting in hand than its E-mount cousins, though it remains comfortably smaller than what I think its bogey must be, the Canon 5D. I really like the way it feels. In fact, you can think of the A99II as a mashup of the Canon 5D Mark IV and the Sony a7R II, DSLR and mirrorless, a clever mating of improved ergonomics that hew more closely to the 5D than anything else from Sony, including what we can call a biodynamic design language with a little edge, along with the more practical, if mundane items like a top plate LCD and the aforementioned thumb and forefinger control dials. And of course, a wholesale raid of Sony's parts bin in an attempt to go beyond playing catch-up to the 5D series. And there is nothing wrong with that. But therein lies both its promise and its challenge. Because in spite of that wild autofocus configuration, that gorgeous sensor, ergos that are indeed superior to anything else in Sony's hybrid lineup, and which DSLR shooters will immediately find familiar, a lovely EVF, a battery much bigger than the standard issue PEZ-sized ones found in the A6 and A7 series cameras, stills image quality and video capabilities that the Canon 5D Mark IV, the 5DS twins, or any other DSLR can't touch in the same body, if at all, and yada yada yada. The Sony A99II arrives as tectonic shifts are already well underway in the marketplace, which conspired to reduce the relevance not only of the 5D Mark IV, and again, DSLRs more generally, but everything else in or near that competitive space. And like every other camera ever made, the A99II is not perfect. Now, Sony itself is conspirator-in-chief of that shift with its own E-mount camera systems. These are smaller, lighter, and in the case of the A6000, 6300, 6500, also dramatically cheaper. Their E-mount, which you can argue has more momentum these days than any other, is, unlike the A99II's A-mount, unburdened by design choices that in some instances go back to the 1980s. Even so, many of those lenses are just lovely, beginning with the 24-70 and 70-200 2.8 I was able to borrow for a few weeks. I found them very close in their optical goodness and form to the Canon L glass of the same spec, and that's saying quite a lot. But Panasonic, Fuji, and Olympus are co-conspirators in shaking up the market as well. And while they haven't had as much time as Canon and Nikon to iron out certain ergonomic kinks, nor raise the bar across all of their lenses to the same degree, chromatic and aberration and distortion being the bugaboos of so many modern lenses in this age of software correction, they're also lighter, cheaper, and in many ways much closer in performance to full-frame cameras than you'd think at anything short of the limit. It's also fair to say that in the hands of a master, or someone committed to mastering it, the A99II is capable of extraordinary imagery, one of the most intriguing hybrids in the market today, or in a pinch, a camera which allows you to crop the hell out of a shot to make it work. Now, even though I am neither a master nor committed to this particular camera, I was able to capture a few crispy, tasty moments like these down in Texas a while back. On the other hand, my yield was not high. It took work and a lot of misses, but I don't blame it all on the A99II. I chalk some of it up to my own muscle memory. The reality is that as a longtime Canon DSLR shooter, and again more recently as a Sony a6000 series shooter, I found the A92 exhibited a lag I simply wasn't used to, somewhere between real life, the viewfinder, the shutter release, and processing. Once I recognized it, it only took me a couple of minutes to compensate. Though, really, I'd rather not have to. But some things I do chalk up to the camera, especially the joystick. It was laggy too. I often had to press it multiple times to get it to work, and that's now been the case with 2 different samples. When it comes to video, the A99II can capture lovely 4K footage, like the pianist in Washington Square at the beginning of this episode. And I didn't set the focus, rather the shutter. But candidly, it's not better than, maybe not quite as good as, what I can get out of my A6300, at least up to 12,800. But the signature feature of the A99II is its hybrid autofocus, and rather than pixel peep the camera to death, we did a quick test of its its video focus performance in the rolling horse country nearby. Let's take a look. You probably saw at least 3 things. 1, the autofocus worked well, except when it didn't. It was set to tracking, but it lost lock. Now, I'm not sure if it was the camera or my lack of familiarity with it, but if I had to wager, I'd say I'm the problem. I didn't begin to explore all the options. I didn't have enough time, but wow. It allows you to select dedicated phase AF only, cross-type AF only, lock-on AF expanded flexible spot, center lock-on AF, AF drive speed, AF tracking sensitivity, and those are just some of the values that you can choose. But with this said, I'm willing to state point blank that number 2, the image stabilization is not class leading, not by a long shot, no pun intended, although it was shot at 70mm full frame. And 3, did you notice a little jitter, as in 1/3200th of a second? Yeah, you heard me right, 1/3200th of a second, because that's where the A99II set the shutter speed in program video mode with a resultant ISO of 800. It would have taken 6 stops of neutral density filter to get down to a more cinematic 24p 1/50th of a second. That's because, as buds like Max Uriev, Dan Watson, and others have already pointed out, the A99II's autofocus isn't available in manual, aperture preferred, or shutter preferred during video. It's only available in program mode, and it locks the aperture at f3.5. Of course, this has significant implications when filming. On the one hand, this only in video program mode and only f3.5 autofocus is so counterintuitive as to border on the absurd. How could something so highly spec'd be this limited, especially when no such limitation exists in any of Sony's E-mount cameras? On the other hand, it's important to understand that this isn't a bug, but a choice that the pellicle configuration gives them. Sony went for all-out stills autofocusing supremacy, understanding the limitation that would result when shooting video. Now, you can argue that if you're shooting in the first three modes, you're probably focusing manually anyway. And if you're not, you probably need all the autofocus help you can get. But I'm not sanguine about that logic. Yes, if you're a professional sports photographer, perhaps this isn't a huge issue. The f3.5 limitation is only in video, and when photographing athletes, a higher shutter speed to freeze the action is what you would probably have chosen anyway. And f3.5 isn't far off the 2.8 maximum aperture of most 70-200s or the longer primes used in sports photography. But if you're pulling double duty on the field or at weddings or news events doing video as well, I think this f3.5 limitation is a real problem, especially without internal NDs. Now, maybe you're also thinking you'll be using cine lenses anyway. Hold that thought for a moment. In fact, let's go back to the glass. As I said, the 24-70 and 70-200 are big and beautiful. As a former 5D2 owner, I felt right at home with both of them, and sharpness was lovely. But at $2,100 and $3,000 a pop, they are not inexpensive. And surprisingly, chromatic aberration is always lurking, especially with the 24-70. They're also heavy. I was surprised by how comfortable I've become with smaller glass, like the Panasonic 12-35 2.8, which tips the scales at just over half a pound and costs just under $1,000. The 24-70 clocks in at about 2 pounds, while the 70-200 is almost 3. Like the Canon glass I used to have, both A-mount lenses seem to be from the relatively old school photograph-only world. A little noisy when focusing, not unpleasant, but noticeable. Like all photography zooms too, they are not parfocal and they do focus breathe if these things matter to you. Okay, you may be the kind of image maker who prefers big, fast, meaty, full-frame stills-centric AF glass. You may be more a photographer than videographer. If so, you have a lot of lens choices for A-mount, including Zeiss, Sigma, Samyang, Tokina, and a pile others. There is a fairly large catalog of older glass out there, beginning with Konica Minolta, from whence the A99II descends. In short, if you're already invested in A-mount glass and want to maximize that investment, or you want to invest in other A-mount glass, well, Sony's A99II has just given you a big reason to do so. But the very best glass Sony offers in this space, the G Master series, is E-mount only, not A-mount. And you can't adapt E to A. You can adapt A to E because of the E's short flange distance. Zeiss has ratcheted up its lens offerings in the E line with the Loxia, Batis, and Tuit. Again, all E-mount, not A-mount. And you know that thought about using Cineglass? Well, Cine lens makers like Fujinon, Sigma, and the legendary top-of-the-food chain Cooke Optics aren't adapting their glass to A-mount. They're adapting it to E-mount. In other words, the A-mount is not the most adaptable or well-supported mount for use with Cine lenses, so the notion that you're going to focus manually if you're not in video program mode is a bit problematic, optimistic. In the end, I think the Sony A99II is a litmus test, a Rorschach test kind of camera. It ultimately tells us less about itself than it does about us, what we value, what we shoot, how much time we're willing to spend to master our gear, and where we want to put our money. Put simply, I think it's fair to say that the A99II outpoints the Canon 5D series in stills and video by virtue of its sensor and EVF, but I'm not sure the hybrid AF is as good as, let alone better than Canon's dual pixel AF. Frankly, I'd have to spend more time with both. I think the ergonomics are a matter of personal taste, but essentially a toss-up, though Sony's rear LCD is dramatically more useful. On the other hand, if you told me you preferred Canon, I'd understand. Then again, both are less compromised still cameras than video cameras, though I think the A99II is miles ahead of the Canon when it comes to video-centric features like focus peaking zebras, codecs, frame rates, and more. Which leaves us with this. If you are already in the mirrorless camp, the A99II may be less interesting than you might have hoped. A paradoxical case of too much, too little, too late, too big, too heavy, too expensive, too complicated. If your primary interest is in video, there are other, more evenly balanced hybrids out there. Cameras that offer better stabilization, play better with the rest of the cinematography ecosystem, are easier to use, and or cost less. Even though most of them don't focus as well, if at all, in autofocus. Sony's E-mount cameras are compelling alternatives, but suddenly so are cameras, as I said earlier, from Panasonic, Olympus, and Fuji, like the GH5, the OMD EM1 Mark II, and the XT2. Canon's EOS M5 is not nearly in the same class. It doesn't shoot 4K, let alone have dual card slots or so many other things. But it is mirrorless, with all of the advantages that entails. It does have dual pixel autofocus, and it's just under a third of the price of the A99II. Then again, the M5 doesn't have much of a lens selection, and as soon as you move to lens adapters, my experience is that all cameras' AF performance tanks. But not everyone likes small bodies and smaller controls. Not everyone likes a crop sensor. Not everyone is satisfied with the choice of a traditional pentaprism DSLR or a small modern mirrorless camera with all of its limitations. Those people are looking for something else. Now, if you are one of those people, the A99II is a fascinating, unique proposition, and I encourage you to check it out for yourself. As for me, well, I'm standing pat with my little A6300 and adding a GH5 for those times when I need video functionality nothing short of an FS5 in the Sony lineup can give me, like long recording times and better ergos. But, as always, your mileage may vary. If you like what you've seen here today, please give a thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation below. Wow, what an informed group of people. And if you're so inclined, support our work by using the affiliate links in the More section below. For Three Blind Men and an Elephant, I'm Hugh Brownstone. See you next time.